Every human being alive today descended from people who were dark-skinned. Not most humans, not the majority, every single one. The people who became the ancestors of Northern Europeans, East Asians, Indigenous Americans, Pacific Islanders, all of them trace their lineage back to a population that lived in sub-Saharan Africa and had skin dark enough to absorb the full intensity of equatorial sunlight without damage. That is not a theory, it is one of the most well-supported conclusions in modern genetics, confirmed across decades of research and multiple independent mines of evidence. The human species began in Africa. The skin that came with that beginning was dark. And then, as groups of humans began leaving Africa, starting approximately 70,000 years ago, something changed. Not immediately, not in a single generation, not because anyone decided anything or because any conscious adaptation was made, but slowly across thousands of years in populations that had moved into environments where the sun behaved differently than it did on the equatorial plains where the species was born, the skin began to change. And the reason it changed is one of the most elegant stories in human biology. It is a story about light, about a vitamin, about the specific physics of ultraviolet radiation and what happens when a body built for one environment spends 10,000 years in another. It is also a story about what the body was protecting in the first place, because dark skin did not exist by accident. It existed because something in the African environment made it necessary. And understanding what that was is the only way to understand what happened when it was no longer there. Melanin is a pigment produced by specialized cells in the skin called melanocytes. Its primary function, in the context of human evolution, was not decorative, it was protective. Specifically, it protected against ultraviolet radiation, the component of sunlight that, in sufficient doses, damages DNA, degrades folate in the bloodstream, and causes mutations in skin cells that accumulate over time into cancer. Near the equator, ultraviolet radiation is intense and year-round. The sun is high in the sky for more of the day. The atmosphere filters less of its energy, and the cumulative UV exposure across a lifetime is dramatically higher than at higher latitudes. For a species that spent most of its time outdoors, hunting, gathering, moving, this was a constant biological challenge. High melanin concentration in the skin addresses the challenge directly. Melanin absorbs UV radiation before it can penetrate to the deeper layers of skin where DNA damage accumulates. It is, functionally, a biological sunscreen, one that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in exactly the environment where it was most needed. But melanin has a cost. It blocks not only UV radiation that causes damage, but also UV radiation that triggers a critical biological process, the synthesis of vitamin D. Vitamin D is not technically a vitamin in the conventional sense. It is a hormone precursor, produced when UVB radiation penetrates the skin and triggers a conversion process in the tissue beneath. And it is essential for an extraordinary range of biological functions: calcium absorption, immune system regulation, bone density, neurological development, reproductive health. In the high UV environment near the equator, dark skin is a net benefit. The UV intensity is high enough that even with heavy melanin blocking a significant portion, enough UVB penetrates to maintain adequate vitamin D synthesis. The protection against folate degradation and DNA damage outweighs the cost of reduced vitamin D production. But when humans moved north, the equation changed. At higher latitudes, UV intensity drops dramatically. Not just in winter, though winter at 50 degrees north latitude means months where UVB radiation is so low that essentially no vitamin D synthesis occurs regardless of skin tone. But even in summer, the angle of the sun means UVB must travel through significantly more atmosphere before reaching the surface, filtering out a much higher proportion than reaches the equator directly. For a population with high melanin concentration arriving in Northern Europe or Northeast Asia, this created a serious biological problem. The same pigment that had protected their ancestors from UV damage in Africa was now blocking the limited UVB available in the new environment, preventing the vitamin D synthesis their bodies needed to function. The consequences of severe vitamin D deficiency are significant. Rickets, the softening and deformation of bones, is the most visible, but vitamin D deficiency also compromises immune function, impairs reproduction, disrupts calcium metabolism, and has been linked to increased susceptibility to a range of infections. In a population already under the stress of a new environment, new pathogens, and new food sources, chronic vitamin D deficiency was not a minor inconvenience. It was a population-level health crisis. Natural selection, operating over thousands of generations, responded. Individuals with slightly lower melanin concentration, mutations that reduced pigmentation, had a survival and reproductive advantage in low UV environments because their skin allowed more UVB penetration and therefore more vitamin D synthesis. They were healthier, reproduced more successfully, and passed their lower pigmentation genes to more offspring. Over thousands of years, this process, repeated across every generation in every population that had moved to lower UV environments, gradually shifted the average pigmentation of those populations toward lighter skin. It was not fast. Population geneticists estimate that the full transition to light skin in European populations occurred over approximately 10,000 to 20,000 years. That is a long time in human terms. In evolutionary terms, it is extraordinarily rapid, a clear signal of strong selective pressure acting consistently in one direction. The genetic evidence for this process is remarkably detailed. The gene most associated with skin pigmentation in European populations is SLC45A2, along with SLC24A5, two genes that regulate melanin production in skin cells. Variants of these genes that reduce melanin concentration appear to have spread rapidly through European populations beginning approximately 8,000 to 5,000 years ago, significantly later than the initial migration out of Africa, and coinciding with the shift to agricultural lifestyles that reduced time spent outdoors and therefore further reduced UV exposure. This timing is significant. It suggests that the lightening of skin in European populations was not a single gradual process that began when humans first arrived in Europe. It accelerated during the Neolithic period, when the combination of reduced outdoor exposure from farming lifestyles and the adoption of grain-based diets lower in vitamin D from animal sources created even stronger selective pressure toward lighter skin. In East Asia, a different set of genetic variants produced similar reductions in pigmentation through a largely independent evolutionary pathway, a phenomenon geneticists call convergent evolution. The same outcome reached through different genetic mechanisms in response to the same environmental pressure. The UV hypothesis predicts exactly this pattern, and that is what the data shows. The geographic distribution of skin pigmentation across human populations correlates almost perfectly with average annual UV radiation intensity at the latitude where those populations have lived for the longest time. Dark skin near the equator, light skin at high latitudes, intermediate pigmentation at intermediate latitudes. The map of human skin color is essentially a map of the sun. The story of why ancient humans changed color after leaving Africa is, at its core, a story about a single molecule and two competing demands it could not satisfy simultaneously. Melanin protected the genome from UV damage, but it also blocked the UV that made vitamin D possible. In high UV environments, the first demand dominated. In low UV environments, the second demand dominated, and the body, across thousands of generations, found the optimal balance point for each environment it occupied. This is evolution working exactly as it works, not with foresight, not with intention, not toward any particular goal, just selection pressure acting on variation, generation after generation, until the population reflects the environment it lives in. The people who became lighter-skinned in Northern Europe did not choose to change. They did not know they were changing. They simply, generation by generation, survived and reproduced at slightly different rates depending on a genetic variant that affected a pigment they could not see and a vitamin they had no name for. And the result? 10,000 years later, is the range of human appearance that now exists on Earth. Every shade of human skin is an answer to a question the environment asked. The question was always the same: how much UV can you afford to block given where you are? The answers look different, but they are all solving the same problem. They always were.